probably don't. I know what you do. Maybe I love you as once the way I did once when I was sleeping and I didn't know what the hell was going on. Hi guys, welcome to the first proper episode of Fairy Tales with Jen. I announced a couple of weeks ago that I was going to start this series, mostly where I'm going to be looking at the history of fairy tales, but quite a few other things besides. And today, for the first episode, is going to be a history of Sleeping Beauty, so where it came from and what we know and think of now when we think of Sleeping Beauty. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that I grew up with Disney as well, and if Disney is the heart and soul of your existence, then be warned that I might be about to stamp all over your childhood. But I find this all really, really fascinating. You know, where stories come from and how we adapt them to our time and place. I also have to say that this video has to have a trigger warning for sexual assault, for cannibalism, because that is the kind of thing that fairy tales used to have in them. I won't be going into detail on any of these things, but if those are subjects that you don't want to hear anything about at all, then please do click away now and go and find something happy on the internet. It's really difficult to work out where stories such as fairy tales come from because they're adapted and changed over time, and they're a massive part of oral tradition. So talking around campfires, telling stories at work, getting them passed on through countries, and there are lots of different adaptations of the same type of stories. So we find these tropes that appear again and again. For instance, two tropes that are within Sleeping Beauty: a prophecy at birth of death and rescuing a woman from a tower can be found in something as far back as ancient Egypt. There was an Egyptian fairy tale called The Doomed Prince, and when he was born, it was said that he was going to die, and then he went off on an adventure to save a woman from a castle, as you do in fairy tales. So there are things like that that we can trace, little pockets of stories that we can piece together to find out where things come from. And it's not just due to oral tradition, but also because of low literacy rates, and also to do with the fact that the printing press wasn't invented until the 15th century, which meant that books couldn't be produced and sent out to the masses. If you want to know more about the history of books, you can check that out in my book, the Bookshop book, which I will link down below. We'll also be talking about more to do with class and fairy tales and who made up these stories and why in another video later on as well. There are four main tales of Sleeping Beauty from the 14th century onwards. There are several more aside from that, but there are four main famous ones. The first one of these stories was written in the 14th century. It was thought to have been written in 1330, but it wasn't published until after the printing press had been invented. So it was by an anonymous French author, and it was a series of stories called Perceforest, and it was this mythical, made-up history of England. It was a huge thing, and during the third book, on the 46th chapter, we get the story of Princess Zeladine. That is the first name we have for Sleeping Beauty, Princess Zeladine, not an Aurora in sight. Princess Zeladine was born to a king and queen who loved her very much, and they had this party for her. They invited three goddesses who bestowed gifts upon her, naturally, except one of these goddesses got annoyed by something and decided that she didn't like the princess anymore, so she said she was going to damn her to eternal sleep when she grew up, which is not particularly friendly, and I'm sure didn't get her invited back to future parties. And what is interesting about this Perceforest story is that it kind of has a series of apologies put in place, which the future stories don't. Which makes it slightly more progressive, if we can really call it that, for its time. I'll explain as we go on. So Princess Zeladine grows up and she falls in love with this prince called Troilus. Troilus is also in love with her. It's a mutual love, all very nice, a young love, excellent. Troilus rides away out of the kingdom on a trip. Zeladine goes around the castle looking for fun, discovers a spinning wheel and thinks, oh, what's that? Pricks her finger on a piece of flax and falls into an eternal sleep. Her dad and her mother are absolutely heartbroken, and her dad decides that to protect her, he's going to put her in the top of a tower on a bed, absolutely naked, which I know is what I do when I'm feeling vulnerable. So he puts her in this tower completely naked, and Troilus comes back. He is helped up to the top of the tower by this zephyr that flies him up there, and when he gets into her room, he finds Venus there, casually. And Venus says to Troilus, you know, you should probably sleep with her, because, you know, why not? So it has this kind of apology in it, as I said. So Troilus and Zeladine, they had already met, they had already fell in love, which is not the case later on, and here is Venus telling him to do it. So if you're going to blame anyone, blame the woman for telling him, right? So Troilus follows Venus's advice and he sleeps with Zeladine while she is asleep. So he rapes her and then he goes away. Zeladine becomes pregnant 9 months later. She gives birth to a baby in her sleep, which I think deserves several gold stars, actually. And this baby is born, and thinking that her finger is a nipple, sucks on it and draws the piece of flax out, which breaks the spell, and Zeladine wakes up. You'll notice here that the trope of 100 years is missing, and that also love's first kiss isn't what wakes her up. So she wakes up, she's got a baby, her aunt is there, she's like, I don't really know what's going on. She's very upset because she no longer is a virgin. She's realised that this child is hers, so she's had sex while she's been asleep and therefore is a ruined woman. So she is beside herself. And not only that, for some bizarre reason, a bird then comes through the window and steals her baby. And we never see the baby again. So... However, Zeladine then realises that she has a ring on her hand, which wasn't there before she fell asleep. She realises that it's Troilus' ring and that he must have been the one who slept with her. So she decides that's probably okay, even though it's not. And Troilus comes back, they get married, they live happily ever after. So that is the first instance of Sleeping Beauty. So this tale of Perceforest was spread and inspired a couple of Catalonian fairy tales on the same subject, which in turn inspired an Italian folklorist to put together a story called Sun, the Moon and Talia. And this Italian folklorist was called Giambattista Basile, and this was in 1634. What's quite interesting is this is after Shakespeare's time, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Now, Giambattista Basile's version of Sleeping Beauty, as I said, called the Sun, Moon and Talia, is decidedly more gruesome and longer than Perceforest. So it's about a princess called Princess Talia. There are no evil fairies in this one. The king simply decided to ask some fortune tellers what they thought would happen to his daughter, and they said, I think she's going to die, mate, or maybe fall into eternal sleep, which was probably not a great thing for him to ask, silly man. So Princess Talia, she falls asleep when she's about 15 and she's placed in a tower. There's no forest at all, but one day a king is riding by on a horse and his falcon leaves him and flies into this really high window and he can't get him back. The falcon's not coming back, so he finds this ladder that happens to be lying around, very convenient. He climbs up this very convenient ladder into the tower and he finds Talia lying on this bed naked. And what does he decide to do? Exactly right, he rapes her, and there is no Venus there telling him to do it this time. So when he does do that, you can't actually blame a woman this time. So he has sex with Talia, this king, and then he goes off feeling very pleased with himself, and he is married to someone else. He completely forgets about Talia, this woman that he's had sex with, who was asleep in a tower. I don't know how he managed to forget about that, but he did. Talia is pregnant and she gives birth to twins. Again in her sleep, 2 gold stars for her. And these twins again suck out the piece of flax that's in her finger and she wakes up. She calls her children the Sun and the Moon. And by this point, 9 months later, the king has miraculously remembered about this sleeping woman that he had sex with. So he goes back to find her. She's very confused in this tower with these babies thinking, who the hell are you? He explains she's very grateful and she says, thank you very much. Can you please take care of me? This was kind of a commentary on kings and how they had mistresses, because he then takes her back to his home, except in a secret hideaway house, because he doesn't want his wife to find out. However, his wife does find out and she's not very happy about it. She demands to the cook that he bring her Sun and Moon and bake them into pies so that she can feed them to the king. So the cook, feeling sorry for these little children, goes and kills other animals instead, puts them in a pie, feeds them to the king. The queen says, I want Talia, I want her put in a pie too. So the cook goes and finds a bigger animal, puts that in a pie, feeds it to the king. By this point, the queen is feeling quite smug with herself because, by the way, there are 3 types of women in fairy tales. There is the young, vulnerable woman who needs saving by a man. There is the young, promiscuous woman who is very, very dangerous. And there's the old, evil woman who's most probably a witch. And she falls into this category, the queen. She's feeling very, very smug with herself, but then one day she hears Talia and she's so cross that she builds this big fire in the courtyard and she demands that Talia come and be tied to this fire and be burnt at the stake. What I love about fairy tales also is the very blasé language when it comes to very serious things, because it just makes it all the more ridiculous and insulting. So this is a little bit from the fairy tale. After Talia has found out that the queen wants to burn her, when Talia heard this, she tried to excuse herself and say that it was not her fault that her husband had taken possession of her territory when she was asleep, which is true. But the queen did not want to hear her excuses and had a huge fire built in the courtyard of the palace and ordered that Talia be thrown onto it. Realising that things had taken a turn for the worse, Talia knelt down in front of the queen and begged her to give her at least the time to take off her clothes first. So, realising that things had taken a turn for the worse, because it wasn't bad enough when she was asleep, you know, and cursed, and then raped by this man and had his babies unwillingly. This is definitely, you know, taking a turn for the worse now. And also I love that she thinks that taking her clothes off will make things better. I don't know. Anyway, the king appears at this point. The queen says, well, I fed you your children. The cook says, that's not true. Actually, I saved them. And therefore the king decides to burn the queen at the stake instead. And then they all live happily ever after. And just to put the cherry on top here, the last line is this. And after all her trials, the princess realised that even when asleep, a person can be struck by luck. Oh my. Now, the Gian Battista Basile version, as I said before, has a lot of Shakespearean elements in there, and specifically Titus Andronicus. Titus Andronicus is Shakespeare's first and bloodiest play. It didn't go down too well. He put it on, people watched it and were like, Bill, what gives? So he decided to put a lot more romance and humour in his later books. One of the plot lines within Titus Andronicus, which is based around Rome, is that one of the women in it is raped and her hands and her tongue are cut off so that she can't tell anyone about it. She can't say anything, she can't write it down. And as punishment later down the line, these people are cooked and put into pies and fed to their relatives, which is something that used to happen a lot in Greek mythology. Apparently this is some kind of weird punishment that is everywhere, you know? Put children into pies and feed them to people. So after this Italian story, we move into French and Charles Perrault, who wrote Sleeping Beauty. This is the first time that Sleeping Beauty, the term, has been used in the title, and it was written in 1697. And this is where we start to see the Disney version that we know. So the princess in this is not called Princess Aurora. In fact, she has no name. It's an anonymous woman who doesn't apparently need a name. She's just called Princess. And when she is born, 7 fairies are invited to bestow gifts on her. They don't invite the 8th fairy because they think she's dead, because she hasn't left her house in 50 years. But it turns out that she's not dead, and she's mightily annoyed, and she turns up and she says her gift is the gift of death, thank you very much. At which point one of the other fairies comes forward and says, my wish is that death doesn't happen to you, and actually you go to sleep for 100 years instead. So it's the first time that we hear mention of 100 years, and also that we have this Maleficent type figure. When she pricks her finger and falls asleep, the king and queen leave the castle, but everyone else within the castle is also put to sleep by the fairies, and she is asleep and waiting for her prince to come, who does 100 years later. However, he does not kiss her to wake her up. She wakes up on her own because 100 years have passed, and therefore she just wakes up. So again, there is no love's true kiss here breaking the spell. They have 2 children, one called Aurora and one called Day. But his mother, the prince's mother, is very suspicious of where he's going all the time. She's part ogre, and she likes to eat children. That's what people say about her. And she's very, very cross about where he is going off to, because no one is good enough for her son. This is something to do with physical appearance, and deformities and disability and otherness kind of representing evil, which is something that I will talk about in a whole other video. But she is part ogre, and his dad had married her because she had a lot of money. So she summons one of the servants who's been traveling with the prince and says to him, where is he going? What is going on? This servant breaks and says, well, actually he's got this secret wife over there with 2 children, sorry. At which point the queen says, I need you to go and fetch them for me, which he does, and then she plans to put them in a cauldron full of reptiles. Unfortunately though, she is caught and she throws herself into the reptile pit instead. After the French version, we move on to the German version, which you're probably quite familiar with, and that is the Brothers Grimm version, in which there is no rape and there is no cannibalism, so double ticking there. There are a few different versions that were written between the early 1800s and the 1850s, and this is called Briar Rose. Briar Rose is born, and 12 fairies this time come to her party. The 13th one is not invited. She storms in a rage again, she puts a curse on her, and one of the other fairies negates that and says no, actually she's going to sleep for 100 years. Everyone is put to sleep when Briar Rose pricks her finger on a spinning wheel, including the king and queen. They are all put to sleep for 100 years. Then a prince comes and he discovers this castle which is covered with thorns, and when he approaches it, these thorns turn to flowers and they move for him, so he's able to get past. So there's no Maleficent here fighting him, nothing to do with that. He easily gets to the castle, he finds the princess, he kisses her, she wakes up, they all live happily ever after. So this is what the Disney one is mainly built on, except they embellished the character of the evil fairy. They gave her a name, they gave her a plot, they had her stick around and fight Prince Philip towards the end of the film. Prince Philip, who is called Prince Philip because of the UK Prince Philip, which I find slightly bizarre. We can see many different elements within Sleeping Beauty from other things. For instance, we can see the myth of Persephone. Persephone is a Greek myth. She was stolen by Hades, god of the underworld, and taken down into his lair to be kept and used basically as a sex slave. Persephone's mother was outraged by this and struck a deal with Hades so that he could only have her for 3 months of the year, which happened to be the autumn and winter months. So whenever Persephone was not in our world and was in the underworld, the real world slept, i.e. it was winter. And within Sleeping Beauty, when Sleeping Beauty is asleep, all of the nature around her changes. There are thorns growing everywhere, everyone else falls asleep. And if you look much further forward, you get things like Narnia, which have taken things from Sleeping Beauty, and also Persephone, where it's always winter because Jadis rules and she is seen as Eve, this creator is sin. Aslan, who is Jesus, is not there at the moment, so the whole world is sleeping and not having a very nice time. The tale of Sleeping Beauty throughout the ages shows many different things, that women don't have to consent, that women should be seen and not heard that they're best just to sit there and look pretty, preferably asleep if possible. It's a bit of a shame when they wake up. It's very odd when we sit down and we look at a culture that's been presented to us as normal from a very, very young age, one that's very heteronormative and plays on this romance. But really, even the Disney version shows women as non-communicative and as beautiful and asleep, as these sexual objects that should be seen as trophies almost. This prince goes out to claim her, he is hers. That's something that goes back to the beginning of time. Aurora in the Disney film has the fewest lines of all Disney main characters, excluding Dumbo, who says nothing at all. Aurora has 18 lines. 18 throughout the whole film, and she has no lines at all after she's woken up by her happily ever after true love kiss. Nothing to say for herself in the slightest. I find fairy tales and their history absolutely fascinating. They take the best and the worst of our society and they twist them and stretch them into these new things. I just find it very odd that so many problematic elements of fairy tales are still romanticized these days. We're going to stretch the worst side of Sleeping Beauty. We can talk about things like date rape culture. I'm also going to leave a link down below to a Vice article on what is called the ghost rapes of Bolivia. It's an extremely harrowing read where these women were told a folk tale to try and explain a horrific event that was happening to them, and it's very relevant to Sleeping Beauty. So I'll leave it down below. If you think you can handle reading that, then please do go ahead and check that out. So as well as all of the stuff that I've been mentioning today, there are quite a few rewrites of Sleeping Beauty, so many different retellings that you can find these days in YA novels and further afield. I'm going to mention a couple of my favourites here. The first one is quite an obvious one probably, and it is The Sleeper and the Spindle. This is by Neil Gaiman. It's illustrated by Chris Riddell. It's a crossover of Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, where the princesses save each other and absolutely kick ass. There's also The Book of Lost Things by John Connolly, and this encompasses a whole range of different fairy tales of a boy who finds himself in this weird, strange fairyland world, but Sleeping Beauty is quite a big part of that retelling. In a more abstract way, we have things like Sleeping Beauty appearing in this, which is The Valley of the Dolls, which was first published in 1966. This is about a group of women who moved to New York, and they are trying to lose weight, they're trying to be famous, they're trying to do all of these different things. One of the things that they can do is go to a sleep clinic for 10 days where they're put to sleep and they can lose lots of weight, and it's called their beauty sleep. It's definitely taken from Sleeping Beauty. And that again is then an element that appears in Helen Oyeyemi's short story collection, What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours, where there are sleep weight loss clinics. So that's everything that I want to talk about today with regard to Sleeping Beauty. I really hope that I haven't destroyed your childhood too much, but I do find this history of storytelling and the treatment of women absolutely fascinating. I'll be touching on more how women got involved in the telling of fairy tales in a separate video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you'd like to support what I'm doing, links to the books that I've written are always in the description box down below. I hope you guys are having a great week. I don't know how often these series of fairy tale videos will be going up, once a month perhaps. I'm not going to have a strict schedule, but they'll definitely be coming up in the future. I'll speak to you guys very, very soon. Lots of bookish love. Bye.